That conversation gave me an idea. If Karen was going to force this issue, maybe it was time to get the community involved. I called Bob Martinez and proposed a special HOA meeting to discuss the restaurant proposal. Let's put it to a vote, I suggested. Democratic process. David, are you sure about this? Karen's been rallying support all week. She's got people convinced you're planning to turn Pine Lake into Atlantic City. Then let me present my actual plans. Give people the facts instead of Karen's hysteria. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening at the community center. I spent the rest of the week putting together a presentation that would make any restaurant investor proud: architectural drawings, parking solutions, noise mitigation plans, even projected economic benefits for the community. But Karen wasn't sitting idle either. Friday afternoon, I found a professional-looking flyer in every mailbox around the lake. The header read, SAVEP INALAKES RESIDENT IALCHAR the CTER, with a subheading that made my teeth clench: Stop commercial exploitation of our peaceful community. The flyer was a masterpiece of fear-mongering. It included artist renderings of what my commercial development might look like. Apparently, Karen's artist had envisioned something between a Hooters and a Hard Rock Cafe, complete with neon signs and a parking lot that covered half the lake. Below the drawings was a list of projected impacts. Heavy truck deliveries starting at 5 a.m. Live music and entertainment until midnight. Alcohol service leading to public intoxication. Tour bus traffic and commercial signages. Increased property taxes due to commercial zoning changes. The flyer concluded with a call to action: attend Saturday's HOA meeting and vote NO on commercial development. Protect your property values and quality of life. I had to admit, it was effective propaganda. If I'd received this flyer without knowing the actual plans, I'd probably vote against it too. That evening, as I sat on my deck reviewing my presentation notes, I heard the distinctive rumble of a diesel engine. Rick's surveillance van was being replaced by something much larger, a commercial moving truck with HENDERSO, NPRAPE, ARTYMANA, GNENT painted on the side. The truck positioned itself not just at the end of my driveway, but extending across the road in both directions, forcing any traffic to navigate around it. This was no longer passive monitoring, it was active intimidation. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Morrison, no relation to the previous cabin owner, explained that as long as the truck left one lane open for emergency vehicles, it wasn't technically blocking traffic. I understand your frustration, Mr. Wilson, but this appears to be a civil HOA dispute. Unless someone's breaking a specific law, our hands are pretty tied. As I hung up the phone, I realized Karen had just made a crucial mistake. Her escalation tactics were about to backfire in a way she never saw coming. Because nothing motivates people like being inconvenienced by someone else's petty war. The community responds. Saturday morning brought an unexpected caravan of vehicles struggling to navigate around Karen's strategically positioned moving truck. The truck had transformed my normally quiet road into a traffic nightmare, forcing everyone attending the HOA meeting to experience Karen's intimidation tactics firsthand. By 10 a.m., I'd received 6 phone calls from neighbors who were suddenly much more interested in hearing my actual restaurant proposal than Karen's apocalyptic warnings. David, this is getting ridiculous, said Margaret Chen, from 2 lots down. I've lived here for 12 years, and I've never seen anything this petty. What exactly are you planning that's got Karen so worked up? Why don't you come by this afternoon? I'll show you. Margaret arrived around 2 p.m., followed by Jim and Susan Peterson, the Johnsons, and surprisingly, 3 other neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. Word was spreading through the Pine Lake community like wildfire, mostly because everyone had to drive past the moving truck to get anywhere. I gave them a tour of the deck explained the historical permits, and outlined my actual plans, a small cafe serving coffee, light meals, and evening dining. No live music, no alcohol except wine with dinner, no tour buses, and definitely no neon signs. "It sounds lovely," Margaret said, admiring the view from the deck. "My husband and I have been talking about how nice it would be to have a place to walk to for dinner instead of driving into town." Jim Peterson was studying the space with the eye of someone who understood construction. "You'd need to add some infrastructure, commercial kitchen equipment, additional restrooms, proper grease disposal. But the bones are definitely here." "What about parking?" Susan asked. I pointed to a large flat area next to my cabin. The original permits included space for 20 parking spots there. "It's all graded and ready. Frank just never had to use it." As my impromptu tour continued, more neighbors arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others because they were frustrated with the traffic situation Karen had created. By 4 p.m., I had 15 people on my deck, and the conversation had shifted from skepticism to planning. "You know what this place needs?" said elderly Mr. Kowalski from the far end of the lake. "A good fish fry on Friday nights." "I've got a boat I could supply fresh lake perch." "And we grow vegetables," added the Johnsons. "Nothing fancy, but we've got more tomatoes and herbs than we know what to do with." I looked around at my neighbors' people I'd barely known a week ago and realized something had shifted. Karen's heavy-handed tactics had created something she never intended: community solidarity. At 6 p.m., an hour before the official HOA meeting, I had 23 neighbors on my deck, sharing potluck dishes and discussing everything from menu ideas to construction timelines. It felt more like a neighborhood block party than a property dispute. That's when the white Escalade pulled up behind the moving truck. Karen emerged wearing her most formal blazer, a burgundy number that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She surveyed the gathering on my deck with an expression that could have frozen the lake in July. "Well," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I see David's already hosting his commercial enterprise without proper permits." The conversation on the deck stopped abruptly. 23 faces turned toward Karen with varying degrees of annoyance, curiosity, and barely contained amusement. "Karen," I called out, "would you like to join us? We're just having a neighborhood discussion about the restaurant proposal." "This is exactly what I warned everyone about," she continued, ignoring my invitation. "Uncontrolled gatherings, noise, disruption of the residential atmosphere." Margaret Chen stood up from her lawn chair. "Karen, we're having a conversation. You know, that thing neighbors used to do before everyone got lawyers." "And speaking of disruption," added Jim Peterson, gesturing toward the moving truck, whose brilliant idea was it to block the road all week. Karen's composure cracked slightly. "That truck is monitoring compliance activities to protect our community's property values. By making it impossible for the mailman to deliver packages?" asked Susan Johnson. "Because that's what happened to us yesterday." The mood on the deck shifted. I could feel the community's frustration with Karen's tactics crystallizing into something more focused. Mr. Kowalski, who at 78 had probably dealt with more than his share of petty tyrants, stood up slowly and addressed Karen directly. "Young lady, I've lived on this lake for 30 years. I've seen property disputes, zoning fights, and enough HOA drama to fill a library. But I've never seen anyone try to solve a problem by making life miserable for everyone else." He gestured toward my deck. "This young man has a reasonable proposal for a reasonable business in a spot that's zoned for it. You've got a problem with that? Fine. But don't take it out on the rest of us with your truck blockades and scare tactics." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Karen looked around at the faces staring back at her neighbors she'd lived near for years, people she'd served on committees with, families whose children had played together. "I'm trying to protect this community," she said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. "No," Margaret Chen replied firmly. "You're trying to control it. There's a difference." Karen's face went through that familiar color progression again, ending at an angry red that clashed spectacularly with her burgundy blazer. "Fine. We'll settle this at the meeting tonight. And when your property values start dropping because of commercial traffic and noise, don't come crying to me." She stomped back to her Escalade, but instead of leaving, she pulled out her phone and began making calls. Even from the deck, we could hear her agitated voice through the open car window. "She's calling in reinforcements," Jim observed. I nodded, watching Karen gesture emphatically while talking. "The question is, will it be enough?" But what happened at that HOA meeting shocked everyone, including Karen herself. Because sometimes, when you push a community hard enough, they don't just push back. They unite. The meeting, the Pine Lake Community Center, had never seen a crowd like the one that assembled at 7 p.m. that Saturday. Cars filled the small parking lot and spilled onto the grass. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years showed up carrying lawn chairs and thermoses of coffee. Karen arrived 20 minutes early with what appeared to be a small army of supporters, mostly people from the newer development on the south side of the lake, who'd never visited my property but had received her inflammatory flyers. They clustered in the front rows like a burgundy blazered battalion. I set up my presentation materials at a small table near the front, trying to ignore the whispered conversations and pointed stares. Bob Martinez looked overwhelmed as he called the meeting to order. "Folks, I know we're here to discuss David Wilson's restaurant proposal, but let's keep this civil. Everyone will have a chance to speak." Karen immediately stood up. "Bob, before we begin, I want to note that this entire proceeding may be moot. I've been in contact with the county planning office, and there are serious questions about the validity of those old commercial permits." My stomach dropped. I'd been so focused on the community relations aspect that I hadn't considered Karen might challenge the permits themselves. "What kind of questions?" Bob asked. Karen smiled triumphantly. "The permits were issued for a different property configuration. When the lots were consolidated in 2003, the commercial zoning should have been reviewed and potentially revoked. The fact that it wasn't might have been an oversight." She pulled out a folder thick with official-looking documents. "I've filed a formal request for permit review with the county. Until that's resolved, any commercial development would be premature." The room erupted in confused murmurs. I felt the careful momentum I'd been building start to crumble. Karen had found another legal loophole, and she was wielding it like a weapon. But then Margaret Chen stood up. "Karen, can I ask you something?" "Of course. In all the time you've lived here, have you ever actually talked to David about what he's planning? Like, sat down and had a conversation?" "I don't see how that's relevant." "Because I did," Margaret continued, "and so did 20 other neighbors this afternoon. And you know what we found out? His proposal is nothing like what you've been telling everyone." She turned to address the room. No live music. No tour buses. No neon signs. Just a small cafe with good food and lake views. The kind of place where we could walk over for breakfast instead of driving 20 miles to town. Jim Peterson stood up next. "And Karen, since we're talking about property values, let me ask you this. Would you rather have a well-maintained, successful small business as a neighbor or an empty cabin that goes into foreclosure because the owner can't afford your legal fees?" "That's not," Karen started. "Because that's where this is heading," Jim continued. "David's got a choice. Open a business to pay for your legal battles, or lose his home fighting them. Either way, you're not getting what you want." More neighbors began standing up, each sharing their perspective on the restaurant proposal. To my amazement, the sentiment was overwhelmingly positive. Even some of Karen's supporters seemed to be wavering as they heard the actual details instead of the apocalyptic projections. Then Mr. Kowalski took the floor. "I want to tell you folks a story," he began in his gravelly voice. "Back in 1985, before most of you were here, we had a similar situation. Young couple wanted to open a small marina where the old Patterson place is now. Same arguments, property values, noise, commercial traffic." He paused, looking directly at Karen. The woman leading the opposition was convinced it would ruin our peaceful lake community. She organized meetings, filed complaints, made everyone's life miserable for 6 months. What happened? Someone called out. The couple gave up and moved away. The property sat empty for 3 years until vandals burned down the main building. Then it sat as a charred eyesore for another 2 years before someone bought it cheap and turned it into the McMansion that's there now. His eyes never left Karen's face. The woman who led that fight? She admitted to me years later that she was wrong. Said she wished she'd tried to work with them instead of against them. The room fell silent. Karen's face had gone pale. "The difference is," Mr. Kowalski continued, "that woman learned from her mistake. She never made the same error again." Bob Martinez cleared his throat. "Does anyone else want to speak before we take a vote?" To my surprise, Tyler Henderson, Karen's son, stood up from the back of the room. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "I'd like to say something." Karen spun around in her chair, her face a mask of surprise and growing horror. "Tyler, this isn't the time." "Actually, Mom, it is." Tyler walked to the front of the room. "I've been measuring decks and taking photos for you all summer, and I've seen how you operate. This isn't about protecting the community. It's about control." The room was dead quiet. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. "David's deck is beautiful," Tyler continued. "So is his restaurant idea. I ate at the Italian place in town last week, the one that's 20 miles away and costs twice what it should. We could use something better, something local." He turned to face his mother. "Mom, you taught me to stand up for what's right. Well, this is me standing up. David's not the enemy here." Tyler walked back to his seat, leaving Karen staring after him with an expression of complete shock. The room remained silent for a long moment before Bob called for the vote. "All those in favor of supporting David's restaurant proposal?" Hands shot up around the room, not just from the neighbors who'd visited my deck that afternoon, but from people who'd never spoken to me before. Even some of Karen's supporters were raising their hands. "Opposed?" Karen's hand went up along with maybe 6 others from her original supporters. Even some of them seemed hesitant. "The motion passes overwhelmingly," Bob announced. "David, you have the community's support." As people began filing out of the community center, chatting excitedly about menu suggestions and opening dates, Karen sat alone in her front row seat, clutching her folder of legal documents. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen Henderson didn't strike me as someone who accepted defeat gracefully, especially not public defeat in front of the entire community. What I didn't expect was how far she'd be willing to go to get revenge. The sabotage. The first sign of trouble came on Monday morning when I discovered that my water had been shut off. Not reduced pressure or brown water, completely shut off. I called the utility company, expecting to hear about a broken main or routine maintenance. Instead, I got transferred to 3 different departments before finally reaching someone who could explain the problem. "Mr. Wilson, we received a complaint about potential commercial water usage without proper permits. We're required to investigate any reported violations, which means temporarily suspending service until we can verify compliance." "Who filed the complaint?" "I'm sorry, but I can't release that information." "Of course not." But the timing, less than 48 hours after the HOA meeting, made the source pretty obvious. By Wednesday, I'd also lost electrical service, reported safety violations, requiring inspection and trash pickup, commercial waste disposal permit verification needed. Karen was systematically trying to make my property uninhabitable. Each service interruption required fees, inspections, and paperwork that would take weeks to resolve. Without water and electricity, I couldn't live in the cabin, let alone plan a restaurant. It was bureaucratic warfare at its finest. I was sitting on my deck Thursday evening, frustrated and planning my next move, when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Margaret Chen appeared through the trees, carrying a large thermos and looking determined. "Heard you were having utility problems," she said, settling into one of my deck chairs. The morning I found Karen Henderson standing on my property with a tape measure and a clipboard, I knew my peaceful retirement at Pine Lake was about to become a war zone. What I didn't know was that her petty crusade against my deck would accidentally launch the most successful lakeside restaurant this county had ever seen. My name is David, and 3 years ago, I bought what I thought was my dream cabin on Pine Lake, a gorgeous 2-bedroom log home with 200 feet of pristine shoreline. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Frank, had built a beautiful wraparound deck that faced the water. It was nothing fancy, just weathered cedar planks and sturdy railings, where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the mist rise off the lake. The cabin came with something else I hadn't bargained for: membership in the Pine Lake Homeowners Association, and more specifically, its self-appointed enforcer, Karen Henderson. Karen lived in the largest house on the lake, a gaudy McMansion that looked like someone had dropped a suburban palace into the middle of the wilderness. She drove a white Escalade with custom plates that read HOA Karen, even though she wasn't actually the president. That honor belonged to a mild-mannered retiree named Bob, but everyone knew Karen pulled the strings. The first time I met Karen was at the annual HOA meeting in the community center. She wore a cream-colored blazer and carried a leather portfolio thick enough to choke a horse. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it could have been mistaken for a facelift. "You must be the new owner of the Morrison place," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Karen Henderson, compliance coordinator for the Pine Lake HOA." I shook her hand and immediately regretted it. Her grip was like a vise, and her smile didn't reach her pale blue eyes. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Beautiful area. I'm looking forward to being part of the community." "Oh, I'm sure you are." She flipped through her portfolio. "I've been meaning to stop by. There are a few items we need to discuss regarding your property." The way she said items made my stomach drop. But I smiled and nodded, still naive enough to think we were just making friendly conversation. That conversation ended with Karen handing me a 3-page document titled Pine Lake HOA Architectural Guidelines and Compliance Standards. She pointed to several highlighted sections with her perfectly manicured nail. "Just some light reading," she said with that plastic smile. "I'm sure you'll find it fascinating." But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered when I actually read those guidelines. The trap. 3 days later, I was sitting on my deck with the morning paper and a steaming mug of coffee when I heard the distinctive crunch of gravel in my driveway. Through the pine trees, I caught a glimpse of white paint and chrome Karen's Escalade. My peaceful morning evaporated like the mist over the lake. Karen emerged from her vehicle, wearing a different blazer navy this time, and carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. She had a young man with her, probably her son, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Good morning, David," she called out in a voice so artificially cheerful it could have sweetened artificial sweetener. "Gorgeous day, isn't it?" I set down my coffee and walked to the edge of the deck. "Morning, Karen. What brings you by?" She gestured to her equipment. "Oh, just doing some routine compliance checks. You know how it is keeping the community standards up for everyone's benefit." The young man who I learned was indeed her son, Tyler, began unfolding a measuring tape that looked long enough to survey a small county. Karen pulled out her clipboard and started making notes. "I hope you don't mind, she continued, "but I've had some concerns brought to my attention regarding your deck structure." Concerns? I felt my jaw tighten. What kind of concerns? Karen's smile faltered just slightly, replaced by the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. Well, David, according to the Pine Lake HOA Guidelines Section 4.2, Subsection C, all deck structures are limited to a maximum of 400 square feet without special architectural approval. She gestured broadly at my deck, which wrapped around two sides of the cabin like a wooden hug. "Tyler, honey, let's get some measurements." For the next 20 minutes, I watched Karen and her reluctant son stretch their tape measure across every inch of my deck. Karen called out numbers, while Tyler dutifully wrote them down, occasionally shooting me apologetic looks. The sounds of their measuring, the metallic snap of the tape retracting, Karen's sharp voice calling out dimensions created a rhythm of impending doom that made my chest tighten. "Well," Karen announced finally, consulting her clipboard with obvious satisfaction, "it looks like we have a problem." "And what problem is that?" "Your deck measures 847 square feet. That's more than double the allowable size." She looked up at me with those cold blue eyes. "I'm afraid you're going to need to remove approximately 450 square feet to bring it into compliance." The morning air suddenly felt thin. I gripped the deck railing so hard my knuckles went white. "Karen, this deck was built by the previous owner. It's been here for over 15 years. Surely there's some kind of grandfather clause." "Oh no, David." She shook her head with mock sympathy. "The guidelines were updated just 2 years ago. All existing structures have a 5-year compliance window. You inherited that obligation when you purchased the property." She handed me an official-looking document with the HOA letterhead. "You have 30 days to submit architectural modification plans showing how you'll bring the structure into compliance. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $100 until the violation is corrected." Tyler finished packing up their equipment and headed for the Escalade, clearly eager to escape. Karen lingered for a moment, savoring her victory. "I know it seems harsh, David, but rules are rules. We can't have everyone just building whatever they want, can we? Property values depend on consistency." She turned to leave, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "Oh, and David? I'd recommend getting started on those modifications right away. 30 days goes by faster than you think." As the Escalade disappeared down the gravel road, I stood on my supposedly oversized deck, looking out at the lake that had brought me so much peace just an hour earlier. But what Karen didn't know was that her little measurement exercise had given me an idea. And what happened next would make her regret ever pulling out that tape measure. That afternoon, I drove into town to the Pine Lake Municipal Building, a modest brick structure that housed everything from the mayor's office to the dog catcher. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Mary Sullivan, the town clerk, was a silver-haired woman in her 60s who'd lived in Pine Lake her entire life. She knew everyone, everything, and most importantly, she had no love for Karen Henderson. "Let me guess," Mary said, when I explained my situation. "Karen's on another compliance crusade. You've seen this before?" Mary laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Honey, Karen has terrorized half the lake with that clipboard of hers. Last month, she tried to force the Petersons to remove their bird feeder because it wasn't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic." She pulled out a thick file folder labeled Pine Lake HO, a correspondence. "The thing about Karen," Mary continued, lowering her voice, "is that she knows just enough about HOA law to be dangerous, but not quite enough to avoid stepping in it." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Well, for starters, that compliance coordinator title she loved so much. It doesn't actually exist in your HOA's bylaws. She made it up." Mary flipped through several documents. The real authority lies with the elected board president, Bob Martinez, and he's never authorized half the compliance actions Karen takes. This was interesting, but it didn't solve my immediate problem. What about the deck situation? Is there anything I can do? Mary's eyes lit up. Now that's where it gets fun. Let me show you something. She pulled out a large plat map of Pine Lake and spread it across the counter. The lake was roughly circular, surrounded by dozens of properties marked in different colors. See these red properties? Those are the original lots from when Pine Lake was first developed in 1987. The green ones were added in Phase 2, 1994, and the blue ones, including yours, were Phase 3, completed in 2001. She tapped my property with her finger. Your cabin sits on what used to be 3 separate lots before they were combined. The HOA guidelines, Karen loves to quote, they only apply to structures built after the lot consolidation in 2003. My pulse quickened. So my deck predates the guidelines? Not only that, Mary said with a grin, but according to the county records, your deck was actually built with the commercial permits. Commercial? Why would a residential deck need commercial permits? Mary's grin widened. Because Frank Morrison, the guy you bought from, originally planned to open a small lakeside cafe. He got all the proper zoning, health department approvals, everything. The only reason he never opened was because his wife got sick and he had to focus on caregiving. She pulled out another document, the original permit application from 2008. According to this, your property is zoned for mixed residential and commercial use. That deck of yours? It's technically approved as an outdoor dining area for up to 60 patrons. The implications hit me like lightning. So if I wanted to open a restaurant? Mary's eyes twinkled. Honey, all you'd need to do is reactivate the permits and pass a health inspection. Karen's HOA guidelines don't override county zoning laws. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. Karen wanted me to cut my deck in half? Fine, but she was about to learn that sometimes, when you back someone into a corner, they don't just fight back, they fight smart. But first, I had to deal with her next move. Because knowing Karen, this was just the opening salvo in what was about to become an all-out war. 5 days later, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox, the kind with return address labels that scream LAGALCORE, ESPONDENCE in intimidating font. Inside was a letter on Pine Lake HOA letterhead, signed by Karen in her self-proclaimed role as compliance coordinator. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It referenced sections and subsections of the HOA guidelines, quoted property value studies, and included phrases like willful noncompliance and legal remedies available to the association. The final paragraph made my blood pressure spike. Please be advised that failure to begin modification of the non-compliant deck structure within the next 14 days will result in the association pursuing all available legal remedies, including, but not limited to, daily fines, liens against the property, and forced compliance through architectural modification at the homeowner's expense. Attached was an estimate from Karen's preferred contractor, her brother-in-law's company, coincidentally for $8,500, to surgically remove excess decking while maintaining structural integrity. I called Bob Martinez, the actual HOA president, immediately. David, I'm so sorry about this, Bob said when I read him the letter. I've talked to Karen repeatedly about overstepping her authority, but she insists she's protecting property values. Bob, do you actually want me to cut my deck in half? There was a long pause. Honestly, your deck is one of the most beautiful features on the lake. It's been there forever, and it's never bothered anyone except Karen. But she's got the guidelines on her side, and she's threatening to call for a special board meeting if I don't back her up. What if I told you there might be another solution? I explained what Mary Sullivan had discovered about the commercial zoning and the original permits. Bob was quiet for so long I thought we'd lost connection. David, are you seriously considering opening a restaurant? I'm considering all my options. Another long pause. You know what? If you can pull this off legally, you have my blessing. Karen's been terrorizing this community for too long. Maybe it's time someone showed her that her little rulebook isn't the final word on everything. That evening, I sat on my supposedly oversized deck with a yellow legal pad, sketching out ideas. The deck was perfect for outdoor dining. It caught the morning sun, had gorgeous lake views, and was positioned to capture the breeze off the water. More importantly, it would drive Karen absolutely insane. I was deep in thought when headlights swept across my driveway. A white Escalade parked next to my truck, and Karen emerged wearing what appeared to be her most intimidating blazer black with military-style buttons. "David, I hope you got my letter," she called out as she marched toward the deck. I did. Very thorough. She climbed the steps with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. "I wanted to stop by personally to make sure you understand the seriousness of your situation." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Karen pulled out her ever-present clipboard. "I've taken the liberty of scheduling a compliance inspection for next Friday. If the necessary modifications haven't begun by then, the fines will start accumulating immediately." She looked around the deck with obvious distaste, as if its very existence was a personal affront. "I know this seems harsh, David, but someone has to maintain standards. If we let one person ignore the guidelines, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want." "You're absolutely right, Karen. Rules are important." She looked surprised by my agreement. "Well, yes, exactly. That's why I've been doing some research of my own." I pulled out copies of the documents Mary had shown me: the zoning permits, the commercial approvals, the county records. Karen's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as she scanned the papers. "What is this?" "It's the original permit for this deck. Turns out it's approved for commercial use as an outdoor dining area. County zoning supersedes HOA guidelines." Karen's face went through several color changes: confusion, realization, anger, and finally, a shade of red I'd never seen on a human being. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. In fact, I've already contacted the health department about reactivating the permits." "David, you cannot turn your deck into a restaurant." The word came out like a curse. "The noise, the traffic, the people. Actually, I can. And according to the original permits, I can serve up to 60 patrons." Karen gripped her clipboard so tightly, I thought she might snap it in half. "This is ridiculous. I'll fight this." "You're welcome to try." "But Karen?" I smiled at her the same way she'd smiled at me during that first HOA meeting. "Rules are rules." As her Escalade disappeared into the night, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. But I also knew this was far from over. Karen Henderson didn't strike me as someone who accepted defeat gracefully. What I didn't realize was that she was already planning her next move, one that would force me to commit to this restaurant idea whether I was ready or not. The escalation. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. A white van from Henderson Property Management parked at the end of my driveway, effectively blocking my access to the road. Karen's brother-in-law, Rick, sat in the driver's seat with a thermos of coffee and a newspaper, clearly prepared for a long stay. I walked down to the van and tapped on the window. Rick rolled it down with obvious reluctance. "Morning, Rick." "What's going on?" "Sorry, David. Karen hired me to monitor compliance activities on the property. I'm supposed to document any commercial development that violates HOA residential zoning restrictions. By blocking my driveway?" Rick shrugged. I'm on the county easement. Technically legal. I looked at the van, then at Rick's uncomfortable expression. Karen was escalating faster than I'd expected. Rick, you know this is ridiculous, right? Look, I just do what my sister-in-law pays me to do. She's convinced you're planning to turn the whole lake into some kind of commercial district. He gestured toward my cabin. Says you're going to have buses full of tourists, loud music, drunken parties. It's a lakeside cafe, Rick. Coffee and sandwiches, maybe some evening dining. Not a nightclub. But Rick just shrugged again and rolled up his window. Over the next 3 days, Rick maintained his vigil at the end of my driveway. Karen had found a legal loophole. He wasn't actually trespassing, and he wasn't preventing me from leaving. He was just making it incredibly inconvenient and sending a message to the entire neighborhood. The message worked. By Wednesday, I'd received calls from 5 different neighbors, all asking about my restaurant plans with varying degrees of concern and curiosity. Mrs. Patterson from across the lake was worried about parking issues. The Johnsons were concerned about noise ordinances. But surprisingly, several neighbors were actually intrigued by the idea of having a local restaurant within walking distance. We've been driving 20 miles to town every time we want a decent meal, said Jim Peterson during one phone call. A nice lakeside place would be wonderful as long as it's done right.